Amen. Those who have published A Loud Cry have not consulted me upon the subject. They claim to have a special message from God to pronounce the Seventh-day Adventist Church Babylon, proclaim her fall, and call the people of God to come out of her, and to try to make the testimony substantiate their theory. How dare mortal man pass his judgment upon them, and call the church a harlot, Babylon, a den of thieves, a cage of every unclean and hateful bird, the habitation of devils, making the nations drink with the wine of her fornication, confederating with the kings and great men of the earth, waxing rich through the abundance of her delicacies, and proclaiming that her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Is this the message we have to bear to Seventh-day Adventists? I tell you, no. That was a series of strong statements that Ellen White gave to the church in the year 1893, which we've already discussed at some length. If you go back to previous studies of Sister Tess, Elder Jeff has already mentioned that year. We know that it has a connection to 2018 and 2019. Therefore, it shouldn't be a surprise to us that the subject of the loud cry seems to be connected with the subject of trying to identify Adventism as Babylon. So I wanted to read that statement to you. It's taken from the Review and Herald, November the 8th. And that particular one is actually written November 1956. So there was Review and Herald 1956, but it's, the original document was written from New Zealand on June the 12th, 1893. So all I wanted to pick up from that statement is that there is an association with the loud cry message of people trying to identify God's church as Babylon. And as we brought to view in the vows, and as we've discussed the movement from our very inception, that we've never attested or held to that position or that view of calling the church Babylon. Now, the reason why this becomes a subject or an issue is not only there's a misunderstanding of what happens to God's church as we go through dispensational changes, but it's partly based upon this structure that we've got here. Now, if we were to read The Great Controversy, chapter 38, or Early Writings, page 277, the chapter of the loud cry, we would see that it's brought to view there the second angel. I know people do it, but I'm suggesting I don't think it's a helpful term to call the angel of Revelation 18 the fourth angel. Because as soon as you start doing that, you start separating mentally and disengaging that the angel of Revelation 18 is the same angel of Revelation 14. 14:8 and 18:2 are the same angel. We read that Ellen White says that the statement of the fall of Babylon as given in Revelation 18 is a repeat of what was mentioned in chapter 14. And she does that in the context which we already discussed of this history here. If this is the Millerite history, this is the history of the 144,000, that this was the second angel's message here, chapter 14, and this is chapter 18, and here the second angel's message is going to repeat what it said here. So I'm suggesting it's not merely a repeat. The angel has never left this earth. It's been here from this point all the way to the end. And as we read from Early Writings 277, I'll just do that picture work there. We have the third angel's message running through history. Then she says, at the right time, an angel comes down from heaven, and you can identify this as being Revelation 18. And this is the third angel. This is the second angel. When these two things happen, there's an empowerment of the third angel. So the third angel becomes empowered here, and she doesn't identify this in the chapter here. It hasn't got chapter number, the loud cry, but this is the Sunday law where this is happening. And you can see that really clearly here in Great Controversy chapter 38. So this is the empowerment of the third angel, and this is Revelation 18, angel coming down. And then in the same chapter, she talks about angels coming down to join it, so that the cry of the third angel swells, or the voice of the third angel swells to this loud cry. So you've got three different messages all happening concurrently in this history here, from the Sunday law to the close of probation. The third angel's message is basically saying, don't receive the mark of the beast. So it's been saying this for a long time, don't receive the mark of the beast. And then here, it suddenly starts to begin to talk with power, because what's happened is Babylon here, Revelation 18, has come to its complete fall. It's now become the cage of every hateful bird. And once this happens, the third angel is now going to speak with earnest to whoever its target audience is, and saying, what I've been telling you for a long time is now present truth. The warning that I've given you of not receiving the mark of the beast because you're going to be destroyed here is about to be fulfilled. So that is the third angel connected with the second angel. Babylon has completely fallen, and therefore its doom is inevitable. In connection with that, there's a third message, this one here, which is, this is 1 to 3, and this is 18 verse 4. This is the second angel's message. This is not the second angel's message. It's a separate, unique, distinct message. It doesn't really have a number like the second or the third. And this message says, come out of her, my people. So it tells you not to receive the mark of the beast, because you will die if you do that. This angel is giving a framework to say the warning that Babylon is in a bad condition has become present truth. It's not going to get any worse. It's committed its last crime. And then there's a third message given to those people who are in captivity here to Babylon, to come out of prison, to come out of her grip before it's too late. So these are these three messages. At that scale, which is this scale, this is Daniel 11 verse 41, the Sunday law in the United States. We will understand what this is referring to. This is referring to Babylon, the system that runs this world. If you go to Revelation 16, it says Babylon at this stage is now in three parts: the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. So once we've come to this stage, Babylon is the entire satanic system that's controlling this world, dragon, beast, and false prophet. All of these things come into effect. So most Adventists realise that from 1844 to the Sunday law, this is the former rain, this is the latter rain, there's this blank space here. And this movement was created to fill in this blank. Basically, at that simple level, that's what we're required to do. Our first step is to truncate this and make it more meaningful to people here at the end of the world. And that's what this line does. I'm calling it the line of, I could call it the church, the final generation, the 144,000. It comes by these various names, but it's the last group of people that are alive. If you went to Matthew 24, it says, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. So we've truncated all of this, and we've arrived here at 1989, at 9/11, and this dispensation is still essentially blank. We still have nothing there. We're in this condition for some time in our movement, and now we've begun to populate this line, and it looks really busy now. I don't think at this scale I'd be able to put all the waymarks in and label them. It would just get messy. So that's what we're doing. We're explaining to God's people how you get from here to here. Ellen White would explain how you get from here to here, but she's very vague. She doesn't give you the details. All the clues are in her writings. All the clues are in the structures of prophecy, or what the term that was used probably earlier today was the patterns that you can see through this truth. So once we begin to address these waymarks to show you how you get from this place to this place, the question is, what kind of rhyme or reason, what kind of pattern, what kind of methodology are we going to use to develop these waymarks to get from here to here? And the answer is, we're going to use fractals. We're going to use various biblical principles. God's dealing with men, he's ever the same from age to age. You get this concept of line upon line. Most of us are familiar with it. I've spoken about it. Others have. We're going to start talking about the priests, Levites and Nethinims. First the church, then the world. Once we start thinking about what we're saying in those terms, then we're going to start looking at these waymarks, and we're going to start saying that the varying histories that we have based upon this template, and if I can just draw it like this, this would be the overarching line of the 144,000. This would be priests, Levites and Nethinims. So you can begin to see that we're going to create these waymarks here which precede this one, and there's not just a beginning and the end, there's other waymarks in these histories, and this is what's going to create these lines here. So the question is, on what authority can we begin to construct these lines, the priests, Levites or Nethinims? And what we're going to do is we're going to take this structure and we're going to essentially shrink it down and create an identical structure here for the priests. Now as soon as you start doing that, you're going to run into problems, because you're going to have to, and I don't mean just at the former and latter rain, you're going to have to start dealing with this second angel. So if I take this out and I say somewhere here, the Sunday law here is the Sunday law here, verse 41, this angel comes down, Revelation 18. And if we're going to get this and squash it down, we're going to have to show or demonstrate that the same thing happens here, Revelation 18. Now, for a long while, we would call this typology, and I've tried to, fairly strenuously, say that you can't have typology in a line. So I'm saying this is not a type of this. It's a progression. And once you begin to see it's a progression, it begins to, and this is just not some unique phenomena. I'm saying the same thing here. This was not a type of this. Because it's a singular line, it was a progressive history. When the second angel message arrived, it never left this earth, and it's always been flying around the globe until you get to this event. I want to just bring your attention. I'm not going to make an application, but I just want you to see this. If I were just to do this, and I did 1A, 1E, 2A, and 2E, the empowerment and arrival of the first and second angels, if you were to read those verses, I'll give you the chapters. This is chapter 14, this is chapter 10, this is chapter 14, this is chapter 18. You're all familiar with that. This angel you're going to see is flying. I'm just going to say in heaven. You'll see 1E, it lands on the earth. You'll see this angel is flying in heaven, and this one is on the earth. So there's little things like this that we really haven't gone into to try and understand the relationship between why this angel is in heaven and why this one is on earth. We have some clues, but we don't have a story that runs through these arrival and empowerment that explain the change of geography from heaven to earth. But the only reason I mention that is if I took this and brought it down here, there's some story about heaven and there's some story about earth, but it's the same angel that's doing that. That's the only reason I want to mention that. Plus the fact someone might want to study that out and see what's going on. So this concept of progression is the same concept that we're going to use here. So again, this is not some new invention that we're not allowed to have typology on a line. It's already embedded in the spirit of prophecy. We're just getting this concept and now making an application here. That's all I'm doing. Making an application of an existing principle that's in inspiration. Now, this has caused us no end of problems when we start thinking about the line of the priest and we start looking at Revelation 18 and when it comes down and what it's doing. So if I took the concept of the second angel here, remember we did 2a and 2e. We've got 2a, 2e, and therefore we should expect the same here, 2a and 2e. I'm saying this 2e here is what's being brought to view here. And it's this 2a here that we have to locate and find. So the line of the priest I'm going to take out for a moment, because we'd already figured this out, a long time ago. Long before we understood about priests. So here we are, and this is 9/11, and here's Revelation 18. So how can we have this angel, Revelation 18, coming down twice? What does that mean? How does it manage to come down twice? And the reason I'm asking the question is because we don't have two separate verses for this. You don't have a verse here and a verse there. So how are we doing that? So I'm saying this is not a typology. What we're saying is this concept of progression. The second angel came down here, and then it's arrived, and it's going to have its empowerment here. This singular line here, this waymark of empowerment, then becomes a period of time. Hopefully we can conceptualize that. And if I just did it like this, don't think that they're like 1989 and close of probation. I'm just doing it like this. So I can connect this up like this. So this is the history of the 144,000. The empowerment of the second is identified as a point, then becomes a period of time. In the same way, its arrival here in Millerite history, because it says second angel was first preached or first spoken about in the summer of 1844, also isn't a singular point. It becomes this period of time. This would be April, and I would contend to July. April to July. You could put August if you wanted. I would argue that the Millerites, who are almost always wrong, but their wrongness, which isn't a word, ends up being right. So they're going to identify July, and we identify August, because we want to correct them, because we're talking about the midnight cry. But I'm saying it's really July that we need to address. Without making that, or having that understanding, we have problems in our own line as we come to this story here. So the empowerment of the second angel ends up being a period of time, and that's what's being identified here. There's this period of time where all of this is essentially 2E, but it's all about scale. So this is all 2E, this is all 2E, as this is E, 2E, as a point in reference to 2A. But not only that, remember the concept of first the church, then the world. So I'm just going to do that simply. I'm going to say church here and world here. And as soon as we start doing that, then people's minds start running amok, and start thinking, okay, this is for the church, and we're giving a warning to the church, and it says Babylon is fallen. Who is our target audience here at 9/11? Who are we speaking to? We're speaking to the church. So we're speaking to the church, and there's this message that's coming to the church, says Babylon is fallen. And it's easy to fall into this ditch, this rut, to say we must therefore be identifying that the church is become Babylon. We've fought this point for a long time, but it still keeps on rearing its ugly head in our movement. The vow stated explicitly, people have left the message because of this issue. In fact, in one part of the world field, I think we had about, we had a nice little group. They were running about, including children, 70 to 80 people. And that group split. I don't know if it's half, right down the middle, but we lost many people in that fellowship over this one issue. And it feels to me that we still haven't put to bed this idea of whether or not we can call the church Babylon. And that's why I read that passage, because it's connected with the loud cry. Someone had this bright idea to produce a tract called the loud cry, and the loud cry was the cry to call people out of Adventism, because they identified Adventism as Babylon, and I'm saying that's not correct. So what's been identified here is a message to the church and a message to the world. And the message to the church is that there's a progressive fall of Babylon occurring, and if you don't identify or recognize what's happening, come Sunday law, you're not going to be prepared for what's about to come upon the world as an overwhelming surprise. So this warning here is a warning to the church that the Protestant churches of the world have come to their last stage. They've completed their fall. And I just want to read that to you. How Ellen White talks about that. I'm going to take this from a number of different passages. The first one's taken from the Great Controversy, page 389, paragraph 2. GC 389, paragraph 2. This is chapter 21, a warning rejected. The second angel's message of Revelation 14 was first preached in the summer of 1844. All I want us to see here is when she says it was first preached in the summer of 1844, what we've tended to do in the movement is, because we're so fixated about April the 19th, second angel coming, we then sort of try to stretch that statement to say, actually the summer of 1844 is April. But obviously it's not. We understand it's spring, and then people have had other arguments. Maybe they didn't fully understand the difference between spring and summer. But this really is the summer. And the reason why I want to point that out is because this here, she has a hard quote for that, which is the one that I've just read. It's in other places. So she's telling you this event, and she talks about the speaking. Now this one here, I'm just going to put the word vague. To understand the arrival of the second angel, it is there. We read an earlier statement about that when we were speaking here. I don't know if you remember me reading that. It says that, this was Early Writings 277, we read it yesterday I think it was, that these angels come and join the third angel as the midnight cry joined the second. Don't you remember that? Yeah? So when it says the midnight cry, if you go back into early writings, I can't remember the page number, but the chapter is called The Second Angel. If you go to the chapter of the second angel, you're going to see the identical scenario here. that the second angel arrives, then sometime later other angels are going to come and join it, and they're going to have this unity. You see the same thing in the passage that we read in our prayer meetings, the Advent movement illustrated. This is a recurring theme. So what we often call, the midnight cry, let me put it that way, we often call that the empowerment of the second, which is fine to do. So this 2E, the empowerment of the second, is not the second angel doing something new or different. And that's different to the first angel. So let me just make sure that you understand what I'm saying. 1A and 1E. This is the same angel. It speaks here and it speaks here. And it's the same angel that's doing that. It's just speaking with a more authoritative voice, if I can express it that way. All of this can be seen from the chapter, The Advent Movement Illustrated. This is not application. This is straight out the Spirit of Prophecy. 2A. Then what we mark as 2E is not the second angel doing something with more power. What actually is happening is the second angel that came into history here is running through, and then I'll just put another angel, but it's multiple angels, come and join the second, and here these angels empower this one. We read that in this chapter, and it's the same scenario as this one here. They come and give power to the third angel. It's not the second angel per se, but we kind of gloss over that, which is okay to do. I'm not saying it's wrong, and we just call it 2A, 2E. So there's a difference between the first angel and the second angel. That's the only point I want us to see. So when we come to this history here, and we've got the 2A, 2E, we know the second angel has already arrived. We've got the evidence for that, but she doesn't explicitly tell you when. She doesn't say like in the spring or something. She says after the disappointment. We know the disappointment, we know the date for that. So we've marked that as the first of the first month because we want to use waymarks to identify things. So we correctly identify the arrival of the second angel here as the first of the first month, and then we go to its empowerment, and often we go to the first of the fifth month. And the reason we do that is based upon this statement here from early writings. It's this empowerment here, which would be the midnight cry, which would be August, and this here would be July. You can see the connection, midnight and midnight cry. So we're going to take that, and what we're trying to do is find all of this. We're trying to find the arrival of that and how we're going to address that. So let me carry on reading this statement. Second angel's message of Revelation 14 was first preached in the summer of 44, and it then had a more direct application to the churches of the United States. This is Sardis. This is Protestant America. Now, what I want us to bear in mind if I were to draw a line from the beginning, the Alpha, to the end, the Omega, and I were to ask how many churches have there ever been on earth? And we'll all correctly say there's been one church. So I would then split it here and pick up AD 34, and I would say this is the Jewish church and this is the Christian church. And then in the Christian church, I'd say how many churches were there? And you'd say there's one church. But there were 7 dispensations of that church, and we can mark there are 7 dispensations in the Jewish church, and you can cut that line and bring it underneath and make application if you're so inclined. So this church, as it goes through these different dispensations, at certain confluence points, which we call a reform line, God is going to enter into covenant with his people, but at the same time, and it doesn't happen on every single reform line, but it happens enough times that we know it's an established truth, that he's going to come out of covenant with a group of people. So essentially what happens is there becomes a rift in the church. So the church is this singular body, and it's going to divide, it's going to rift. So here's this singular church, and at a certain point in history, which I'm going to call a reform line, there's a rift that occurs. And I'm going to use the same picture work that we've got here. People begin to leave. Now, when these people begin to leave, the church just carries on. Even though in reality, it may not look like it's just carrying on in its business as normal. I'm not suggesting that. But in this simple picture work, that's essentially what's happening. And these people here who are being peeled away because of this separation, they fall into the wicked world below. So, the Ellen White quote that I think we read earlier, the church appears to fall, but it remains. And all that's happening is the sinners in Zion are being sifted out. This is the shaking and the sifting. So the people that are coming out are the people who are leaving the church, but the church remains intact. So if we can understand it at that level, if we went to 1798, and I were to ask you, what's the symbol of God's church in this history? You'll tell me it's the fourth church, Thyatira. And then if I were to ask you, who is the church here? You'd say it's the fifth church, Sardis. Now, I'm not making the applications about the parallel between Sardis and and Laodicea. I did that earlier, and Elder Jeff has made that same comment. But all I want us to see is that it's a singular church here and it's a singular church here. And what's going to happen now is we've entered into a reform line, and there's going to be a separation that goes on. So as you walk through this history, people are going to begin to separate. And in this history, you're going to transition from Sardis to the sixth church, Philadelphia. But it's still one church that's going all the way through, and we're going to transition because we're going to call this the Protestant churches, and we're going to call this the Millerite movement, or the Millerite history, or the Millerite people. And then we're going to get to the seventh church, Laodicea, and we're going to say these are Seventh-day Adventists. These people who are falling away, we could call them Sardis, I guess, but I don't want to do that. I just want to say that these are sinners in the church who are falling away. Now, I'm not arguing that Sardis doesn't fall away, it does. And I'm not arguing that if you remain in Sardis, it's a death sentence, just like no Laodicean is ever going to go to heaven. If you're a member of Laodicea, you can't enter heaven. It's impossible to do that. You have to switch to a different church to have a different experience. So in this reform line, that's what's happening. Now, if we can understand that, and I'm just doing this in a simple way. Here's 1844, and we enter into a period of darkness, or mystery of iniquity, from 1844 to 1989. And that's going to be in two stages, 1863 to 1989. And there's this transition stage here where we would call the church entering into compromise with the world, until it goes into the Dark Ages, which is the fourth church, Thyatira. We haven't entered into a reform line here. So as soon as we enter into a reform line, I'll do 1989 to the close of probation. Could put the second advent if I was going to be technical about that. And here, there's going to be a transition. Something's about to change. And now we're in a reform line, we're going to see that people begin to come out. Just in this generic way, they're going to start coming out. I'm not trying to say when or how that happens. And these are the sinners that are leaving the church, and the church remains intact. If we can conceptualize that thought, I want to come back to what we're reading here. The churches then experienced a moral fall in consequence of the refusal of the light of the Advent message. So what that's identifying is the falling away of these people whilst Philadelphia is being created, or the Millerites. We then go through this darkness, and we're going to parallel this thought here. As they have continued to reject the special truth for this time, they have fallen lower and lower. Not yet, however, can it be said that Babylon is fallen because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of fornication. She has not yet made all nations do this. The spirit of world conforming and indifference to the testing truth for our time exists and has been gaining ground in the churches of the Protestant faith in all the countries of Christendom. And these churches are included in the solemn and terrible denunciation of the second angel. But the work of apostasy has not yet reached its culmination. So what's been identified here or here is the culmination of that work. This is the final fall of all those Protestant churches as they've gone completely and fully into apostasy or into fellowship or bed with the beast power here, the papacy. So there's this progressive fall all the way through. So hopefully we can see that. All we're identifying in our reform line is that same model, because this is just a fractal of this, and this is a fractal of this. And we're saying from 9/11, what we're identifying is that this is the progressive fall of Protestantism in our generation. It's not identifying any fall of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is what people want to try to make this. I'm going to read the same comment from Early Writings 277, paragraph 1. It's this passage here. Then I saw another mighty angel commissioned to descend to the earth. This is the second angel. The light which attended this angel penetrated everywhere as he cried mightily with a strong voice, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. I'm going to drop to the end of that verse. The message of the fall of Babylon as given by the second angel is repeated with the additional mention of the corruptions which have been entering the churches since 1844. The work of this angel comes in at the right time to join the last great work of the third angel's message as it swells to a loud cry. That's the Sunday law. That's this. Now, if that's all we had as a church, we would not have the means to make adequate preparation for this. We need to have a warning before. And that's what this angel of Revelation 18, here that's been marked at 9/11, is doing for us. It's awakening our church to the reality that the Sunday law's about to come. We can explain that in different ways. People have explained that to identify this as being AD 70, therefore this would be AD 66. I just want to point out, if we were to do that, if we were to say this was the destruction of Jerusalem when the armies surround, that's an application. Now what's funny is that Ellen White kind of uses that application here to mark the Sunday law, but we know really the destruction of Jerusalem is not the Sunday law, it's the close of probation. Because the Sunday law would be AD 34, when the gospel is given to the world in preparation for the destruction of Jerusalem. But even Ellen White makes application. She does it over and over again. That's why it's quite hard to read the Spirit of Prophecy, because you have to be able to decipher when she's making an application and when she's not. You can see exactly the same thing in CET page 50.4. I'll put that down for you. I'm not going to read that. CET 50.4. It's a recurring theme, this concept of the second angel and how it operates. I'm not very good at numbers, but I just want to make this observation, because I quite like this thought, this idea. You know, we all read the Bible for various reasons. If you're having a bad day, a bad experience, you might go to the book of Psalms to receive some kind of comfort. You might want to understand end-time prophecy. You might be an intellectually based person. There's many reasons why people study the scriptures, not just based upon our personalities, but you know, our experience through life. We read it for varying reasons. Now, we know there are 66 books in the Bible, divided into the Old and New Testament. And I want to make an observation which I kind of find interesting. So these 27 books in the New Testament, I'm going to say they have a common theme that runs all the way through. If you begin with the first book, Matthew, and you end with the last book, Book of Revelation, you'll see that John is on Patmos and he's in captivity. And if you see the condition of God's church here in the book of Matthew, you could just take the four Gospels and bring them together because they're a singular book, really. The story really begins with the taxation of the Jews because the Romans have subjugated them. So if I put Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, it begins with captivity. And if you go through the whole of the New Testament, it's really talking about a people who are in captivity. So I'm saying the 27 books, 100% of the New Testament is a story about captivity. It tells you how we get into captivity, what happens when you're in captivity, and it gives an explanation of how you can come out of captivity. It's all about captivity. Now, those 39 books in the Old Testament, if you were to look at the titles, look when they were written, look at the subject matter, 20 of those books are dedicated to the subject of the Babylonian captivity. Now, some of the other books, they've got at least chapters, sometimes many chapters, that deal with that same history, like Chronicles and Kings. So I'm suggesting, if you just take the percentage, that around 50% of the Old Testament is dealing with one subject, captivity. And if you combine all of that, 75% of the Bible is dealing with one subject. It's dealing with the captivity of God's people. So, the Old Testament is really dealing with the subject of captivity in Babylon, and the New Testament is the captivity by Rome, pagan Rome. And literally in both stories, in both books, you can make spiritual applications. You can think about Egypt, you can think about papal Rome, but literally this is what the Bible's constructed about, and 3/4 of the Bible is dealing with this singular subject in 2 steps. Now, each of us knows that there's apostasy or idolatry that precedes the captivity here into Babylon. I think we all realise that. There's this captivity. So I'm just going to break that line. And after the captivity, there's some kind of restoration. So this captivity here is God's people going into Babylon. So after this restoration, before you get to the New Testament, there's idolatry, there's this captivity, and then there's this promise of restoration. And once you get to the end of the New Testament in its literal story, then we start dealing with prophecy, and then we start going to the 1260, then we come to the end of the world. This story here is contained in the Old and New Testament, Book of Daniel and Revelation, if you can see that, but they're not literal stories that are happening, they're prophetic events that are happening in the future. So let me do that a different way. This is idolatry, then there's captivity, and we could do this would be the 1260, and then there's this restoration, which would be the Millerite history, and we can get the same story when we go further along down the line. There's this captivity, idolatry, and restoration. So we believe in the concept, the principle, the rule, upon the testimony of two a thing is established. So all I want us to see, when God's people are in idolatry and they go into captivity, they were held captive in Babylon, but they never become Babylon. You know, it's so easy to see. I want to express this thought in a different way. If you can hold on to these prophetic patterns, you will see clearly that our church never was Babylon, is not Babylon, and won't even become Babylon. We will go into captivity, we will be scourged and punished, but we won't become Babylon. Connected with that thought, if you can see how this prophetic line is teaching you this upon these varying testimonies, if you've been in conservative Adventism for any length of time, I'm sure you will have heard conspiracy theories that our church has been infiltrated by the Catholic Church, and they use this idea that we have Jesuits in the church now. I'm sure you've all heard that. Some of you may still hold on to that idea. You may believe it. Now, if you're going to hold on to a prophetic model, what you'd have to do is here at the end of the world, here, and if you're going to base this model upon line, these previous histories, if you're going to hold that in our church today, the reason why we're in this big mess is because, sorry, the clock's gone out, so I don't know how long I've got, that the reason we've got, so I'll go on and on otherwise, the reason we're in this mess is because the Jesuits have infiltrated us. And I'm saying that just can't be the case. The reason we're so bad is because we wanted to be bad. We're so bad because we wanted to copy the world. You wanted to go into whoredom. You can come up with any model that you want within reason, but the one that you can't go into is that we've got Jesuit infiltration, and that's why we're in this mess. That's why we've got Catholic doctrines running through our church. That's why we allow priests to sometimes take control of our pulpits or do something, or we have interaction with them. Because if you were going to do that, and we understand that the papal church is Babylon or Rome, you'd have to go back into this model, into the Old Testament, and to this model, into the New Testament, and you'd have to demonstrate clearly that there was either a Babylonian or a Roman infiltration into the church structure. They stopped wearing their Roman garbs, they dressed up like Jews, and they pretended to go through all the rites and ceremonies of Jews so that they could undermine the church. And now all of you know that that just didn't happen, because the Romans didn't need to do that, and the Babylonians didn't need to do that. In fact, we have a different story, don't we? Why is there even any interaction between the Babylonians and the Jews? Why did they begin to interact? Why did they become a subject of Bible prophecy? There are various answers, but the story that I want to give us is that Babylon begins to be employed by God to do a work for him. In Isaiah, it's called the rod in God's hand that's going to be used to punish God's people. So Babylon is going to be used to punish God's people. They didn't infiltrate the church, make them look bad or do bad and say, now we're going to punish you. This idolatry was a self-inflicted wound. They went to Babylon and wanted to copy them, for sure. But they did this all of their own volition. Once they got to a stage where it gets so bad, then God's going to use Babylon to punish the church. You see the same story here with pagan Rome. You see the same story here with papal Rome. And when you come to our history, in fact, even before you come to our history, if you go to the line of the Millerites, and I already drew this out for us, with that subject of the scattering and the gatherings. This was a gathering, there was a scattering, this is 1850. This was meant to be the gathering, but the plan gets derailed because of Satan. He does two things. He makes the world enter into spiritualism, and he makes the church enter into Laodicea. Laodicea is a strategy not to make us worldly and like houses and cars and good clothes. It was a strategy to destroy our prophetic understanding, which was all about time. So by the time you get to 1863, we've now formally entered into a period of scattering, 1260, which is 126, until you get to the year 1989, where we begin to come out. So the Laodicean condition comes to its end here in 1989 at the time of the end, and here Ephesus is born. Just like it was in the time of Christ. Ephesus is created there at the time of the end with the birth of John, the birth of Christ. So this history here, this is a scattering. This was a gathering. This was not meant to be a scattering, but it ends up being such. This scattering brings us to the history here where we're now being gathered. Now, when we were being scattered here, who was doing that scattering? Who was scattering us? We weren't scattering ourselves. We were being punished because of our compromise. And who brings punishment to God's people? God does. God brings the punishment, and He's going to use an agency to do that work. And that is Babylon. But just as the 1260, the papacy isn't going to be able to do that work by itself. It's going to employ the European kings to aid it, so you have a combination of the dragon power and the beast power. And I've explained how that works, the dragon and the beast. There's this combining of these two powers here. We can go from 2520 to 1260 to 126. We still know who we are. We still know that we're God's people. In fact, we have a prophet who keeps on reminding us who we are. But we are in captivity to Babylon. And here, in this history, we begin to come out of that history. Here in 1989, there's a call to our church. It's the first angel's message: fear God, give Him glory, for the hour of His judgment has come. But connected with that, if I can put another layer on, there's a call which is 18 verse 4, which says, come out of her, my people. It says, come out of her, my people. Who is the her? It's come out of Babylonian captivity. Now, this concept is not new. This concept is borrowed, if you want to use that phrase, right here from this story. This captivity is 70 years. At the end of the 70 years, you get to the time of the end. You get to Isaiah 45, 46, 47. Cyrus arises to the throne, and he gives a decree, the first angel's message, that says what? Come out of Babylon. And God's people go from Babylon into the glorious land. You get the same dynamic here in 1798 at the time of the end. God's people are in captivity in the 1260. They're in a scattering. And they're going to leave Europe, which is Babylon, and they're going to come to the United States, which is the glorious land. Again, you can mark 18:4, come out of her, my people. So this is just a repeating, recurring pattern over and over again. So when we come to this model here at 1989, where Ephesus begins, and we're in this history, now we come into this problem here, this Revelation 18 coming down properly, 18:1-3. This is a call, it's a message to Adventism that the end is about to happen and we need to make this preparation. It's an additional waymark, if you like, here, additional truth to begin to help us to track our way to this event. That's what this angel in Revelation 18 is doing. It's not identifying that the church is Babylon. When you get to the Sunday law here, so hopefully this is going to prove my point, this line is the line of what? It's the line of the church. The church never is going to become Babylon. Now there's a message that's going to be given to this group of people to say, come out of her, my people, this recurring theme, and join the church, because the church is not going to be destroyed. What we see these people coming out, this is not the church, it's not the collapse of the church, it's the sinners in church that leave. We have no message to try to identify Seventh-day Adventists as being Babylon, because where does Seventh-day Adventism begin? we could have differing answers. I would suggest Seventh-day Adventists can be easily brought to view to the Church of Laodicea. The Church of Laodicea is the church that's in the New Testament, the Church of Christ. They keep the seventh day, not well, and they believe in the advent of the Messiah, not well. Same thing as Adventists. We claim to be to keep the Sabbath. We don't do a good job of that. And we're supposed to be custodians of the truth about the Sabbath. We don't do that well prophetically because we've really failed that. And we believe in the second advent. So you can begin Adventism all the way back. But if we began Adventism, say here in 1844, Mike 63, we've been Adventists all the way through. So Adventism is running all the way through here. Do we think Adventism stops here and it just collapses? Of course not. Adventism goes all the way through. Amen. We're Adventists, aren't we? Do we not believe that the 144,000 are Seventh-day Adventists? I mean, we can't get embroiled with the legal jargon about Seventh-day Adventist is a registered name with the government and that we can't use or borrow it. Regardless of all of those distractions, Adventism goes all the way through to the very end. What's happening here are people leaving. The collapse of the structure is not Adventism becoming Babylon. It's sinners being sifted out of the church. That shaking is going to be so terrible, it looks so bad. We're going to think the church is totally destroyed or lost, but it isn't. There are so many ways to understand, so many arguments to prove that our church never has been Babylon, never will be Babylon. For us to believe that, we'd have to lose track of the church, or we'd have to identify that the 144,000 are some new group of people. And we know too well that there's only been one church of God from the very beginning of the controversy to the very end. Just want to add one more point. When you start introducing the subject of proxy, which we really need to consider in a serious fashion, and I don't think we often do, the war in heaven was a war between Christ and Satan. That war gets transferred here on earth between two proxies, Cain and Abel, the seed of the woman or the seed of the serpent. So the great controversy on this earth the last 6,000 years is just a proxy war that started in heaven. The proxy war is going to finish here on earth and we're all going to go back to heaven. The reason why I mention that in that framework is because people have this idea that this church, this movement, is not the church triumphant. And the reason why they make that assertion is because Ellen White has some quotes that talk about the church triumphant is in heaven and we're going to join the church in heaven. But I just want to show us just this simple concept. If this is heaven and there's war in heaven, the war gets brought down here to earth as a proxy, and at the end of this we get taken back to heaven. So all that we're identifying here is there's not this distinction between the church of heaven and the church on earth. The church on earth is just an extension of the church in heaven. And this argument about this movement cannot by definition be the church triumphant is based upon another wrong premise, that we've got wheat and tares in our movement. There are sinners, there are bad people in our church, in this movement, the Church of Ephesus. And how can that be? Again, this is all built upon false premises because people don't understand the difference between the bride and the guests. If you think about Matthew 22, Matthew 25, there are other parables that teach this. The individual people, us, we are guests. We're not the bride. We're not the church. We're members of the church. The easiest way I can explain that, at least that makes sense to me, is the distinction between the ark and the man. And if I could just think about the two animals, the clean and the unclean animals. You've got three individuals, but you've got an ark. And when this ark was being built, this is the church triumphant, it takes sinners and saints to construct this ark. So the definition that we use to say the church militant is composed of wheat and tares, and therefore the church triumphant is just wheat or pure people, is accurate. But remember, we had this concept of progression when we spoke about verses. When we talk about the church triumphant having no sinners, that's here. When Noah and all the animals get on the ark and the doors shut, where are all the sinners? They're not there. They've been washed away in the flood. But this church triumphant that's being built, this ark, was built by saints and sinners. And when people identify us as being these saints and sinners, this is not the correct modelling to say that this is not the church triumphant, because we're not the church, we're just members. We're not the bride, we're guests. We're virgins, we're the servants, if you like. I've got a few more minutes. I think I'm probably actually over time. So, we've looked at this line. I've tried to explain how these people who once gave the third angel's message are going to leave. This is another layer. You can't find that in the agricultural model or when we're going to start thinking about harvest. It doesn't fit into that model. You don't see this peeling away that's happening here. The reason they peel away is because they join to the world here. As they fall away, these people become a cursed group. Just like the Jews were a cursed group. They get punished while they're in Babylonian captivity. They're not identified as being part of Babylon. So when our church structure all falls away into Babylon, they're not going to become Babylon. In fact, I don't have time to read the quote, but Ellen White says something along this line. She says, these people will be the first to feel the stroke of the punishment of God. If you're familiar with that statement. Because she identifies as this distinction between God's church. Even when they go into Babylon, even when they go in there, they still don't become Babylon. They just enter into the chastisement of Babylon in that story. I've spoken about Revelation 18. The danger of calling our church Babylon and how it's just a total wrong application. To do that, you fall into the conspiracy theory trap. Because what you've done is you've come out of William Miller's rules about using line upon line. You have one line, two lines. There are only these two lines in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. Babylonian captivity, half of the book is dealing with that subject. 100% of the book is dealing with the Roman captivity. Then we go into prophecy and we see how God's people are scattered. They're still his people. We see how God's people are scattered. They're still his people. And then we come to the final end and the church runs all the way through. It never becomes Babylon. Just want to people got distressed that I put 2014 there at the end of my last presentation. I want to do the line of the priest very briefly. What I haven't had an opportunity to do is to explain how this line was created. This line was created through some convoluted, providential circumstances. I don't like saying we took some risks. I think God's guiding this movement. But in hindsight, when you look back and you see how fragile some of those leaps of faith were at the time, if we had realised it, we may have been more perturbed to actually step out in faith. But when you look back now, when you see how God has led us, everything is in place in the way it should be. Things such as 2014, things such as Raphia and Panium and the placement of them, which were all studies that were done in a really crude and basic fashion have all proven under interrogation and testing to be correct. So this is 2014, this is raphia and panium. I'm saying this is the harvest, this is the latter rain, this is the former rain, and this is the ploughing. People ask the question, when does the judgment of the living begin? And we've, for a long time said it's 9/11, and I'm now saying it's actually 2014, because I'm lining up the Sunday law with 2014. Fortunately, Elder Jeff explained the logic between those two things in his earlier presentation, so I don't really need to do that. All I want to say is when we talk about living, do we mean people who are literally living or people who are symbolically alive? And I'm saying it's not literal. When you start making things literal, you get into a problem. So I'm saying it's symbolic. How do I know that? Because if I were to go here and look at Ezekiel 37, you've got people who are alive here who are being represented as people who are dead. And here they stand on their feet and now they're suddenly alive. But they were alive all the way through because this is the final generation. We know they're literally alive, but they're symbolically alive. So we can show this a number of ways. This is the seed, it's the germination of the seed. Sister Tamina has spoken about that. It's the new birth experience. So here you are born again. You can't even be looked upon or investigated or checked when you're dead, because no man knows anything when they're dead. So you can only begin to be investigated here. The investigated judgment of the living could only begin at 9/11 because you're not even alive here. You're waking up from this death-like experience. It takes time to be converted. But we're marking here the investigative judgment, and he explained the reason for that, because this is the period of record taking and this is the period of investigation. And that's the logic to say why we would place the investigative judgment here at 9/11. Because what's happening here through your life, you're being tested. And testing is really some kind of investigation. It's an examination of what you're doing. So that's what hopefully that's a quick explanation of the relationship between 9/11 and 2014. So here's this movement running through history. And I know Elder Jeff has marked 2008, but I'm going to just use the argument here in 2014 as we bring this parallel down. From 2014, we begin to see in a really serious fashion, and you'll notice, hopefully, when he said in 2008 that separation was over a moral issue. That was the primary reason for that separation. It wasn't really a doctrinal issue. The doctrinal changes or separations began in 2014, and you could argue it wasn't over moral issues. So we begin to see here this peeling away, or people leaving our movement. And I'm saying this model here is the model of these people leaving. They're the former brethren who used to do or give the third angel's message, and they've left. And why did they leave? It said because of this worldliness here that they've got. And I'm saying that worldliness here, if you consider the line that Sister Tamina has been teaching this week, this is because these people were never converted. I'm not interested in people's morality. I'm saying they were never converted to this message, to this truth. It never had converted or changed them. They were time servers, if you like, just like Judas was, a time server. So when they see the storm approaching, they're going to start leaving. And here you get the harvest. And this is the separation of the wheat and tares. The separation of the wheat and tares, I think, has to be connected with a second harvest here. This is the harvest of the priests and harvest of the Levites. Because, again, Elder Jeff mentioned this is the first fruits, and this is the harvest. First fruits and harvest, this is the scale of Adventism. It's the first fruit of Adventism, and then Adventism is going to be properly harvested. We call this the priests and the Levites. So what's been identified here when we think about the church is there's this field, and you've got tares, and you've got this wheat, and this harvest, I'm just going to do it at this simple level, is showing you this progression. First the first fruits, and then the main harvest. The first fruits are going to be cut out of the church. When I say they're going to be cut out of this church, remember, in the model, it's the sinners that are leaving. It's this group here that are going to be burnt. These are going to be taken to the heavenly Ghana. This is the church triumphant. Then the Levites follow the same pattern, and what gets left are all the tares of Adventism, which are going to be burned into bundles. Remember, this is just a progressive work, because all this is happening here. The real destructive work happens here. This is just a progressive history. So I know that was quick, but hopefully this gives you an explanation of how we're going to take this line and bring it into ours, how we're going to explain the separation that we're seeing here. It's not the harvesting of the wheat and the tares. Harvesting of the wheat and the tares happens at harvest time, not pre-harvest. There's no harvest in the latter rain time period. But the separation that's happening is real. These people are falling into the wicked world below, just like these are falling into the wicked world below. In this, they're going to fall into Babylon, and they're going to be cursed. These people are not falling into Babylon. They're falling back into Adventism, ready to be harvested here with the rest of Adventism. You can draw a similar line with the Levites and a similar line with the Nethinims. Now, the reason why all of this is important, without identifying 2014, Raphia and Panim in the way that we have, where we are now in 2018, which is the loud cry here, or what can also be identified as the midnight cry, depending on how you're going to label these. This is where we are today. Now, I'm not objecting or arguing about a particular date, which is October 13th, but October 13th is a symbol. It's a symbol of a clustering of events that all are dealing with this subject of the midnight cry. And we have to remember that the premier waymark in all of this is this one here, which is midnight, because it's the son-in-law that's the premier waymark. In fact, until very recently, we wouldn't even have ever acknowledged, really, that the loud cry is a separate and distinct waymark. We'd normally do it as an escalation, just as I've shown you there. So I believe that we're in the loud cry that's going to bring us to Raphia. It's called the prediction before midnight, because on a different line, which I haven't shown you, this would be midnight, this would be midnight cry, and this would be October. It's taken straight out the Millerite history. That's why it was called prediction before midnight. I prefer the term prediction before the close of probation, because that's what we're identifying. I'm also making the point that this could never have been predicted, because if it had, we would have gone back here and made a prediction about a prediction. So I think you start falling into a circular logic if you start doing that. We've identified this history while we're going over this ground, but what I want to point out to you is an important point. The relationship between June 2018 and September, October 2018. Here, the subject of time setting had been introduced into this movement. And from here onwards, I don't know about yourselves, but you know, if you're someone who has some influence in this movement, people send you information. And I've been inundated with lots of people coming up with theories about time setting. And you know, they'll do these kind of structures like this, and they'll have numbers here and numbers here. and they'll come up with a start date, which would be a year. I don't know, I just took 1750, and it would go to another date in our history or something like that. So they do all these structures, and I respond back and say, that's all good, but what does this mean? What does this date that you're coming up with mean? And the honest answer normally is, I don't know, I'm not sure. What I want us to see is in these few short months where people have now coming out and developing these structures and trying to grapple with this, I'm saying while they've been toying around with all of this, the Lord has already raised up someone, not in June 2018, not in June 2017. This is way back in 2016. The Lord had already raised His chosen messenger to begin to develop these theories, these ideas, and it took that person 2 years. And just at the right moment, when time setting had been allowed to enter into this movement, because God saw that it was the right time, that study had matured and developed in such a way that it could be shared here in the glorious land in the history of September, October. So for all those people who have been developing these lines and these theories, I know people are concerned that we've got lots of numbers everywhere, but you know, where we may have thought, and I know people are struggling with this, that we're here in September, October, time setting is now an open topic. Now we can start wrestling with these ideas and start thinking about how we're going to grapple with time, how we're going to do date or time setting. All of this that work was already done, and we didn't even know it. The Lord had already got this date, 2019, November the 9th, long before June 2018. It's been in the movement for coming up to a year now, and we didn't realise. So by the time it gets delivered, it's a fully mature message, and that's exactly the characteristics that you see with Samuel Snow's message. When you get to July and August, it's not a message that needs developing, it's a fully matured message. So even though we can identify certain dates in the way that, you know, we can pick up a particular day in June and then July and then October, the message was already in place long before those dates were created, and those dates are now going to be used as a secondary witness to help us to establish that what's being taught here in the message that's predicting November the 9th is indeed true. So these are secondary witnesses using methodology that is not the regular methodology that has created this movement, which is line upon line methodology. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you praise and thanks for your goodness and your mercy. Father, as we, at least individually, if not yet corporately as a body across the world field, come to grapple with the concept that we are now in the midnight cry, that we're now, as Samuel Snow did, predicting the close of probation. We want to ask that you continue to be with us and direct us. We know, Lord, that even though we have a fully matured and developed message, there is still so much for us to learn and understand in the coming months. There are still brethren who need to be instructed on these truths. There are hundreds, if not thousands of people across the world field who have only begun to hear these things, perhaps not even in their own language. These preliminary studies need to be developed and need to be taught at a pace that they can absorb and understand and intellectually accept. There are other brethren who have got their own thoughts and ideas. We ask, Lord, that you would continue to guide and direct them. We have confidence, Father, that the truth that you give to your people has your signature upon it. And if that's the case, we know that all your true-hearted children will hear the voice of the shepherd and will come into line. Please be with us and please guide us. We ask and pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.